Hello everyone and welcome to this new video about level design. In this episode, we're going to discuss an important part of the game creation process, the design of nice enemies. Now, I'm not gonna pretend like I can give you a perfect recipe for designing enemies. This is as much an art as it is a science, and every game project will require you to reconsider this problem in a new and unique way. Plus, creating good enemies requires many experts to collaborate, from character artists and animators to AI designers or programmers. Also, here we are not going to discuss bosses, because those are a special breed of enemies that deserves its own video. Rather, we'll focus on the critters, the minions, all the little creatures you see here and there as you progress through the game, and that may appear multiple times during your journey. But with all that being said, there are still some good practices we can follow to start from a sound base and build somewhat interesting and memorable enemies in our games. For example, there are a few core characteristics that a designer usually takes into account when creating a new enemy type for a game. Namely, the speed, the health, the attack range, and the damage per second, which combines both the attack strength and the attack speed. This is obviously a crude depiction of all the possible nuances, and you should definitely not be constrained by these 4 columns, and you shouldn't spend too much time finding precise numbers. Deciding on rough estimates is already a nice first step in designing an enemy. Okay, but what do these 4 measurements really mean? Well, the health will determine how long the enemy will last, and if the fight will be more about reflexes or stamina. It will also impact the amount of resources that you'll need to consume to overcome the enemy. And don't forget that armors and shields are a good way to further increase or decrease this global resistance. The speed has to be tuned compared to the players. It will contribute to the overall threat level of the enemy and the pacing of the fight. The attack range is interesting because it makes for very different behaviors. Melee enemies will need to walk up to you and get close before they can do anything, but then once they're in range, they will simply keep attacking. Ranged enemies, on the other hand, are able to attack quickly, but they'll also have to adapt to the environment, and in particular where you and it both stand currently. Finally, the DPS represents the brute force of the creature, and how much of a danger it is to you if it does hit. So it's up to you to decide whether you're okay with having one-shot scenarios in your game. To help you establish a baseline for your different enemy types, also known as your roster, there are some common archetypes, like the fast and fragile, or the slow and tanky, or the precise tactician. But of course, you're not going to actually show those stats like numbers to the players, are you? So how exactly can you tell your players that this guy has a high speed, low health, mid-range and low DPS, as opposed to this one? Well, a key idea in the field of creature design is that your critters should have distinctive silhouettes that the players can recognize in an instant, and their animations and details should highlight intent, strengths and weaknesses. The Scout and the Heavy of Team Fortress 2 have super clear silhouettes and animations. You directly feel that one runs like lightning but lacks defense, while the other is a tanky guy who's a bit slow but fairly resistant. In short, the point here is to rely on subtle clues to indicate your enemy's stats to the player in a qualitative way. And since many video games ask gamers to react quickly, you need to make sure that these clues are understood easily, so that the players can assess the situation they're in as clearly as possible, and respond accordingly. This idea that the shape of your enemies should inform the players on what kind of antagonist they are, and how they should go about fighting them, is actually an example of the form follows function principle I discussed at length in this previous episode of the series. Here the idea is to use the common knowledge gamers have and rely on those intuitions about the world, be it the real one or a fictitious video game environment, to help them interact with the enemy. Thanks to these affordances, you make it both more believable and more enjoyable to battle your enemies for the player, because the enemies will make sense and they'll react as you expect them to. A series of games that push this concept to an extreme is the Mario saga, where the entire universe is predicated on the intended gameplay. Why is Mario a plumber? Because he goes into pipes. And why does he go into pipes? Because for video game players, pipes intuitively look like open tunnels to another part of the world. And similarly, Mario battles Koopas shaped as turtles because this domed shell instinctively pushes us to jump on it, therefore eliminating the threat. That's actually why Mario's universe might sound silly to non-gamers, and so inherently logical to players. Its whole design, from environment to enemies, is made to support the gameplay first and foremost. Okay, and now to wrap up this quick talk about enemy design, I want to briefly discuss the roster as a whole, and most notably the importance of finding the right balance for your different enemy types. So here are a few rules to keep in mind when preparing a bunch of enemies for your new game. First, you should try and introduce some variety in your roster. Don't just have everyone be fast and light or strong and slow. Mix and match the different archetypes, perhaps try some original combinations, and make sure that each type of enemy brings a new challenge to the players. But at the same time, don't aim for 1,000 standalone enemies. Your diversity has to be well measured, and you can totally reuse some enemy type with a slight variation later in the game, for example with a new accessory or with better statistics. Also, you should create a clear hierarchy for your enemies, with weak and strong types, and you have to make it obvious to the players. It can be a matter of size, or DPS, or even the way the enemy is introduced in a cutscene. Then always give your enemies consistent patterns and behaviors. Players like to watch, learn and repeat. This encourages mastery, which, as we've already said in this series, is always really great. Depending on how realistic you want your game to be, you might of course need to work on the AI too, so that it looks believable and integrates some emotional intelligence mechanics, like an enemy being very strong and courageous, or alone and afraid. And finally, as a bonus, it can also be interesting to think of some emergent systems. What I mean by that is that you can design enemies that don't exactly work the same when they're alone, when they're in group, and when they're in group with another type of enemy. Typically, you could have some shooter and protector combo to face the players with another type of fight while reusing the same enemy types. You don't have new enemies here, it's just that the pairing of the two has created a new pattern. Now once again keep in mind that this video was just a peek at a very complex topic, and this handful of rules is simply a primer for more research. But nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed this quick tips and techniques tutorial about level design, and that you've learned a few things about enemy design. If you did, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And of course, don't hesitate to leave a comment with your own ideas for future level design tutorials. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and take care.